This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it online or pop into your local independent bookstore and ask for Anti-Diet. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journeys towards peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 224 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow anti-diet dietitian Lauren Newman about how to manage diabetes without weight loss and restriction, why the restrict-binge cycle and weight cycling are especially harmful to blood sugar regulation, why carbohydrates are necessary for health, how to take the focus away from nutritional minutiae and numbers, and so much more. It's a great conversation. It's really so needed in this world, and I cannot wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, I have a couple of announcements. So as I'm recording this, I just had my New York City book launch event yesterday, and it was amazing and so much fun to see and talk with everyone who came out. So thank you if you came. It was incredible. We had a standing room only crowd at Blue Stockings, which is this awesome activist bookstore on the Lower East Side. And I had people come from miles and miles away to be there and talk with me and ask me questions, including someone who flew in all the way from Chicago. So it was really amazing and heartwarming to see everyone. I'm still riding the high of that incredible night, but I realized that I haven't really announced any of my book tour spots on this podcast, which is a huge oversight. I've been sharing about them on my social media platforms and in my email newsletter, but I record these intros to the podcast episodes so far ahead of time that sometimes I don't get around to announcing things here until it's too late. But that said, the good news is that even though I've already had a couple book tour stops by the time you're hearing this, there are still a bunch more dates coming up, so you can come see me in various different cities going forward. I'll be in Philadelphia on Thursday, January 30th, in conversation with Caroline Dooner, author of The Fuck It Diet and a 3-time past podcast guest. And then the next day, on Friday, January 31st, I'll be in Cold Spring, New York, in conversation with Virginia Soul Smith, who is the author of The Eating Instinct and also a past podcast guest. And she also was my conversation partner at last night's event in New York City, and it was phenomenal. She's so funny, so smart, and asked really great questions. So I loved being in conversation with her, and I'm excited that we're going to have another opportunity to do that again in upstate New York. And then in February, I'll be doing another event on my home turf in New York City. And then I'm heading down to DC later that month to do an event with Heather Kaplan, also a past podcast guest and fellow anti-diet dietitian. So you can see all the details of these and other upcoming events as I add them at christyharrison.com/book. That's christyharrison.com/book. And the events listings are at the bottom of the page below all the order information. You can also order my book on that page and then follow along with where I'm going to be. And you can also subscribe to my email list so that you never miss an update on my tour dates, because I'm reliably do post about my book tour there, even if I don't get around to saying it on this podcast. So you can go to christyharrison.com/email to sign up for my email list. That's christyharrison.com/email. I'm not going to answer a listener question this week because my interview with Lauren is on the longer side already, and it is so good, y'all. I'm so excited to finally be talking about diabetes in depth on this show. She is doing such important work in the world to help destigmatize diabetes, and help people make peace with food in their bodies while also managing diabetes and other blood sugar concerns. And so it's a great, great conversation. I don't want to have to cut a minute of it. I don't want you to miss a moment of this good conversation. So we're going to get to it. But I'll be back to answering your questions next week. And meanwhile, if you want to submit a question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And if you want to have your questions answered every month, no matter what, no matter where I am in my book tour and in life, even if I can't answer them on the podcast, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals, where I do a special monthly Q&A podcast just for course participants. And there's tons of other amazing content in there as well. So you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by thredUP. Not only is it more sustainable to shop at a thrift store like thredUP, but they also offer 90% off of estimated retail prices, and they make it incredibly easy to sell the clothes you don't wear anymore and trade them in for beautiful, comfortable clothes that fit your body and your style. Instead of spending hours at the racks, you can customize your search on thredUP by your size, including plus sizes, your budget, and more, so you can find the best deals instantly. I just got some amazing pieces from thredUP myself, and you'll definitely spot me rocking some of them on my book tour. Sustainable, stylish, and totally affordable. You'll feel even better in 2020 with beautiful clothes from thredUP. And for Food Psych listeners, here's an exclusive offer. Get an extra 30% off your first order at thredup.com/foodpsych. That's THREDUP.com/FOODPSYCH for 30% off your first order. thredup.com/foodpsych for an extra 30% off today. Terms apply. This episode is also brought to you by Bank United. Right now, you can enter Bank United's Go for More sweepstakes for a chance to win $54,000 if a team goes for and completes a 2-point conversion during the big game on February 2nd. I honestly don't even know what that means because I don't watch football, but I definitely want to win $54,000, and you can enter pretty easily to win. All you have to do is follow @BankUnited on Twitter and tweet at Bank United your answer to what you would do with $54,000 using the hashtag #GoForMore54. Again, follow Bank United on Twitter and tweet at Bank United your answer to what you would do with $54,000 using the hashtag #GoForMore54. Must be at least 18 years of age to enter. For official rules, visit www.goformore54.com. Bank United NA, member FDIC. Neither Twitter nor the NFL entities have offered, administered, endorsed, or sponsored this sweepstakes in any way. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Lauren Newman. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
It's actually interesting because I don't think I really realized that there was anything wrong with my relationship with food growing up when I was much younger until I was a dietitian and started working with eating disorders and realized that my parents always dieted. And I just didn't realize how much that had affected me. I thought my parents they were making sure that we had really nutritious, balanced meals and all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, in reality, my mom was always on a diet. I don't have any real memories of her not dieting. And my dad as well. My mom was just kind of constantly on a diet. And my dad would just go through these periods where he would really hardcore diet and just do all of these crazy things. And then just kind of the classic restrict-binge cycle, right? Then just be I don't really care. I'm just going to eat everything and it's fine. And I don't think I realized how confusing that was for me as a kid until much, much later, probably a year, almost a year or two ago, honestly. So growing up, I mean, my parents were kind of going through that cycle and I didn't really think much of it at the time. My mom would cook dinners at night. We always had food. That wasn't really a big concern. We always had quote unquote healthy food, but my mom wasn't the kind of person to really limit what we were eating. It was more her own stuff. So we were the family that had all sorts of fun food in the house. And I remember my friends whose parents were much more restrictive, they would be the ones who came over and would eat everything at our house. And so I would say it was pretty normal, but I definitely think that my parents constantly dieting from the time I was really young definitely had an effect on me because by the time I got to like fifth, sixth grade, I just had a really messy relationship with food. And looking back, it's really hard for me to piece together a timeline of exactly how that played out. I have like little bits and pieces of memories here and there, but just because I think I was so unaware of how all of that was coming together, like I didn't realize what was really going on.
That's really interesting. And so did that manifest as you dieting and restricting yourself, or how did that look?
Yeah, I mean, I have bits and pieces of memories. So like I remember at one point asking my mom to go to Weight Watchers with her, and she let me come with her. I only went a couple times, but I remember that. I don't remember what led to me wanting to do that. I remember looking up all of these like weird diets online and, trying to follow them for like a couple days and then just being like, I don't know if this is really working. Cause like, when you're 12, you're like, if it doesn't work in one day, it doesn't work. Right.
Yeah.
And I was like kind of impatient with that. I remember at some point I started hiding food, and I don't really remember actually hiding food or what I would hide or like any of that. But I remember my mom and I getting into these like intense screaming matches over it and like really intense fights about it, where she would just yell at me for hiding it and be like, if you're going to eat it, just eat it in the kitchen, eat it downstairs. Like we don't care. Like just eat it, but eat it in the kitchen and don't hide it. Like you don't need to hide it from us. But for some reason I was hiding it. And I mean, looking back now, I know that it was around the time when I was also restricting in a lot of ways. And it makes sense to me in that context of like, now knowing all that I know, that restriction leads to binging. And I was probably really terrified of the amount of food I actually wanted to eat and just wanted to hide it. But I remember that happening. And so that kind of started to get really wonky just because I remember just those fights were so intense and I would have a lot of guilt and shame around it. And my parents approached it in like very different ways, I think, where my mom would get very upset with me about it and not really understand what was going on. And my dad would be like, it's okay. You can eat those foods. Like it's okay. But still kind of would default to my mom on that.
Yeah, I can see how that would be so confusing too, probably given what you observed in their relationships with food and how they ate and how your mom seemed to be really controlling with her own food.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's so normal and so understandable to be hoarding food or hiding food or binging on food in response to restriction too.
Absolutely. And then within this context as well, like I mean, I don't remember the exact timeline of all of these events, but like at some point in there, I went through puberty very early. And so I'm sure I was also just growing and like needed a lot of food. So looking back on it, I can piece this all together. But as a kid, I really had no idea what was going on. And so I just remember feeling like a really intense amount of like guilt and shame and embarrassment around that and around like my body that was changing. And I then would hide those foods and I would eat them. And then, at some point I started engaging in other really disordered behaviors, and it just kind of spiraled pretty quickly into an eating disorder.
So how did it go from there? Was that sort of like high school, middle school time or?
Yeah. Like most eating disorders, the behaviors kind of moved around, and it was just kind of like this constant thing of just really disordered behaviors going on all through middle school and high school. And it's interesting because a lot of what started to happen was that I think a lot of this came from just observing my parents and like their relationships with food. I didn't view what I was doing as disordered. And so I was just like, okay, well, I'm going to eat all these really healthy foods and I'm going to eat like not too much because that's what was modeled to me and like what I thought was healthy. And I was exercising quite a bit. And so the way it was perceived by a lot of people around me, including my family, was like, oh, well, Lauren's just really healthy.
That moniker of the healthy one, oh, she's so healthy, is so problematic. I feel like that really lets people fly under the radar. And I too had that same experience when I was in my eating disorder. It was just like, people were like, what's your secret? You're so healthy. What are you doing? Let me try to do stuff you're doing. And I cringe to think all the people that I told disordered habits to and who admired disordered habits in me that were just literally not good, like so bad for me and so robbing me of my life, and yet was praised and people were looking to see what I was doing. Just, horrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's kind of just the narrative of how the rest of the next few years really played out for me. I mean, in high school, that was a lot of it. I had started working at a fitness studio as well when I was in high school. And so, like, that became a really big part of my life. I spent a lot of time there. And it was just like kind of how people knew me as like, oh, like, that's what Lauren does. She like works out a lot. She works at this fitness studio. I played soccer, so I was like athletic as well, and just had all of these different things going on. That's really the perception that people had. And so I don't think that most of what was going on was really viewed as a problem. I remember a few points where people did voice concern, but it was really just dismissed pretty easily by like my family and by me as well. It's just like, no, this is fine. Like, this is what health is.
So some people did pick up on a little bit of disorder, but you were just like, no, this is healthy.
Yeah.
That's diet culture for you. You know, I think about that now and I'm just like, how many people have suffered in silence and flown under the radar because they quote unquote seemed healthy on the outside? And to this point now where I'm at in my career and the work that I do, I feel like it's actually a huge red flag to me when I see someone who is engaging in all these quote unquote healthy behaviors, who's doing it in a way that's sort of like their identity and they're known for being the quote unquote healthy one. If they're doing it to that degree, I feel like that means there's something amiss. Not always, but a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also like coming from my own experience. I agree with that completely. I think it's a really big red flag when somebody that's such a huge part of their life and it's almost like how you know them. You don't really know much else about them except for those aspects of their life of like what they eat and how quote unquote healthy they are. And I mean, I talk about this now all the time. Like, that's actually really detrimental to our health and really ignores a lot of the other important aspects of our health. So it's definitely a problem.
Huge problem. I mean, I will say, I feel like I am overall have such better holistic well-being in the true sense of the word now than I ever did back then when I was like, quote unquote, the healthy one, or even early in becoming a dietitian or going back to school to become a dietitian, quote unquote, eating like a dietitian, eating like a nutritionist. That was me at my most disordered. And now I don't think anything that I do, whether food-wise or movement-wise, is really perceived by the outside world as like, oh, she's so healthy. Like, if people don't know I'm a dietitian, I don't think they think anything special about my food or movement routines. They don't look to me for guidance or advice. I don't seem like I have, quote unquote, have it all together in that way. And yet I am so much better off. I feel in such better health in general. My blood work and other stuff shows it as well, that my physical and mental well-being are pretty good these days. And they were pretty terrible back when I was, quote unquote, so healthy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was this kind of healthy identity that you had a driving force in deciding to become a dietitian?
I don't think I realized it at the time, but I really think it was. I graduated high school and I went to college. I moved all the way across the country. I grew up in like the New York, New Jersey area and came to the University of Texas for college, mostly because I just wanted to go somewhere warm and like really different. But yeah. I came all the way down here. And I think just there was a lot of the culture shock almost, which sounds weird because it's still within the States, but like Texas is a really different place. And I was in this new place with nobody that I knew at all. And really like wanted that to still be my identity. And so I think that was like what I knew, right? And so, I mean, I still had like a pretty serious eating disorder at that point. Nothing was really happening about it, and was really obsessed with food because one, I thought it was my identity, not just part of it, but like that's who I was, this like healthy person. I was a person that cares about health in like a really extreme way. It was like, I'm better than other people because I like care more about this than other people do. And then I was like, well, of course, then I should study nutrition, right? So I think that played into it. And then I think the other part of it was truly just that I was starving and malnourished, and a malnourished brain cannot focus on anything except food. So those were the classes that were most interesting to me. Like that's what I wanted to spend my days thinking about. And so next thing you know, I'm a nutrition major.
Makes so much sense. I feel like I would have been right there with you if I had developed my eating disorder earlier. As it happened, I was like most of the way through college. When I did, I was 20. I had just come back from a junior year abroad, or developed it kind of in the middle of my junior year abroad. But I was like most of the way through a degree in rhetoric and French literature. So I was like, okay, journalism, media, that's always kind of where I was aiming. That seemed like the thing to do, and I didn't want to have to start over. But I focused my journalism career once I got done with college on food and nutrition, like all the things that I was obsessed with all day long. And it makes so much sense that that is what our starved brains do. That is what brains do when they're starving. It's so understandable to be drawn into a career like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think about it now, and I don't really know. I mean, at this point, I don't really know what else I would want to be doing with my life, but I always wonder about that. Like, what else would my brain have wanted to put its time and attention and energy into if I actually had enough nutrition? I'm not sure, but here we are.
Yeah, we can't change the past, but it is interesting to think about that too. Like, what roads would we have gone down if that path hadn't been laid out for us? I talk a lot in the book too, actually, about this career trajectory that a lot of us go on, and the foreclosing of other careers as a result, and how even that can change our earning potential. Dietitians make a lot less money than some other potential careers we could have had. I tell the story in the book, like when I got laid off from Gourmet, when the magazine folded in 2009, I was already back in school to become a dietitian and had just started the program like a couple months before or something. And it was very expensive. I went to NYU for grad school. So I was like, oh shit, I just lost my job. Like I need help paying for this. And I had heard that unemployment sometimes included benefits for education. I wasn't sure kind of what the criteria were, but I was like, okay, maybe they'll help me pay for school. And I went in to talk to the unemployment counselor, and he basically laughed in my face. He was like, no, we only help cover education that's in a higher paying position than the one you're leaving. And at the time, and I think maybe still now, journalism had a higher earning potential than dietetics. And he showed me numbers and breakdowns and stuff. And he was like, so basically don't do it. Don't leave journalism to go into dietetics. And I was like, well, it's too late. I'm obsessed, and that's what I'm doing. But it really stuck with me that this career that I poured so much money into, I kind of turned the ship around, took all these student loans out, and then lost my job and had a nice severance package, but it, was only a few months. I had just sunk all of this money into this new career that this guy's like, yeah, that's ridiculous. Why are you doing this?
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah. Not that I've ever been someone who was really motivated by money. In fact, I think that's part of the reason I was like, well, who cares? I want to be a dietitian, and that's kind of a privileged position to come from too, because I grew up with enough economic security that my parents were always like, do what you love and the money will follow, which is so nice to hear as a kid, but also such a privilege. It's only people who have money can say that,
Yeah, that was definitely similar in my family. It was you can do whatever you want within reason. I think my dad's joke is always just don't major in underwater basket weaving, but
everything else is on the table.
Yeah, everything else is on the table. You can do what you want to do. You're smart, you'll be able to figure it out and make it work, which is definitely a privileged place to come from. But I remember as well, at some point in there, so I decided to be a nutrition major. And then a couple months later, wound up leaving school to go to eating disorder treatment finally. And then when I came back, I had missed a whole semester. And nutrition classes, it's all the prerequisites, they have to be in the right order, and it's very time consuming, and there's so many classes and no flexibility in that degree plan. And I was like, well, now I'm not going to graduate on time. And that's important to me because I don't know, that felt important. So I was like, okay, well, what can I do to still graduate on time? And so I remember changing my mind 15 times about what I wanted to do. And that's when I really remember having that conversation with my dad about just don't do underwater basket weaving. Everything else fine. Just not that.
That's really funny. Well, that's interesting too, this idea of dropping out of school to go to eating disorder treatment. How did that come about?
The eating disorder really just got to the point where it was unmanageable and I really couldn't ignore it anymore. And so it really hit bottom there for a while. And so at some point, my therapist that I was working with at the time was like, yeah, you don't really have a choice right now. Like you can't go back to school at this point. So I didn't have a full choice in that at that moment in time.
Well, that's really awesome that you had a therapist who was able to say that and get you the treatment you needed. Because I think, even finding a therapist in the first place is pretty hard.
Yeah. I mean, I'm super grateful for that therapist for kind of setting that boundary with me of like, you need to do this right now. Unfortunately, like it wasn't maybe the best treatment. There was just a lot of, now that I work in this field and I know like how we can do things in a really productive way, like there was just a lot of fat phobic things that were going on. And I don't think I realized that exactly at the time, but things felt off to me. And I think that's really what kept me stuck for quite a while, even while in treatment.
Did you experience fat phobia yourself in treatment? Did you just hear comments that were fat phobic that sort of fed the eating disorder?
I think it was a lot of because I was in a pretty whatever average means, average size body. Like I definitely was not in a larger body, but it was pretty average. So I had some thin privilege in that way, but there was definitely comments that were being made around me where it was like, I was in this weird spot where some people around me were in much smaller bodies and needing to like quote unquote weight restore. And like, I technically didn't have to because I hadn't lost that much weight, but I had lost, like, it was just this weird thing. And then there were people in larger bodies in treatment with me who were on like really low calorie meal plans. And I was just really confused. So I didn't really know where I fit. I was like, if I was in one size body or the other, like really, if I was in a larger body or if I was in a much smaller body, I just remember thinking that when I was in treatment, like this would be so much easier because then I would like have a goal and have a point. But right now they just like aren't telling me what to do. And I don't know. It just remember that being very confusing for me.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially when a treatment center is putting larger bodied people on low calorie meal plans. You kind of know it's a diety place. And
oh, totally.
Yeah, I feel like that's sadly, so many eating disorder treatment centers are like that. I had a conversation with Shira Rose a little while ago about the horrible treatment that she's received in some eating disorder treatment centers and how she finally was able to cobble together a HAES treatment team. But finding the right treatment team and not getting triggered deeper into the eating disorder through eating disorder treatment, I think is a tough thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. And then I remember as well, like a little bit later on, because then I was just kind of in and out of treatment for a little bit. And at one point there was a woman who I was in treatment with who was in a larger body. And this was definitely my disordered perception of the situation at the time, like just to be very clear. And I don't really know what the dietitian's intention was with this client, but I remember this woman who was in a larger body and her and like our dietitian were doing some work together around intuitive eating, apparently. And I don't know for all I know, she could have really genuinely been working on intuitive eating in like the truest sense of the term with this client. I have no idea, but all I remember was, okay, well, she's in a larger body and I'm not. And so like intuitive eating is just, again, my really disordered perception at the time, I perceived it as like, oh, well, intuitive eating is just lazy and giving up. And like, that's what you do when you give up on somebody. And like, I don't know why I interpreted it that way, but I had like another friend in treatment. And I remember like her and I having a conversation where we kind of agreed that that's what intuitive eating was. And so, now I know better, obviously, but like, it's just really interesting that was kind of my first introduction to intuitive eating. And I look back on that now and I'm actually very curious what was going on with that client, but that's really how the rest of us in the room perceived it. And so I feel a lot of frustration that wasn't really explained to us. And it wasn't intuitive eating wasn't introduced to all of us. And like, we weren't all educated on it regardless of our size.
Especially because, in eating disorder treatment, Evelyn Tribole talks about the nutrition rehabilitation phase and how people have to go through nutrition rehabilitation first before they can implement the full expression of intuitive eating, like eating according to hunger and fullness and stuff. But people can embrace the other principles and learn to practice the other principles while they're recovering from eating disorders, and they don't need to wait on things like rejecting the diet mentality or learning to make peace with food or learning to respect your body. Like all of these things are useful for everyone, no matter where they are in their recovery.
Absolutely. And I mean, I work in eating disorder treatment now, and that's exactly how I explain it to my clients. And I work currently at an adolescent residential facility. And even with my adolescents in a residential facility, like we are talking about intuitive eating and we're talking about all of it. And the way I like to frame it to them is like, yeah, we have to respect your body and honor your health right now. And in order to do that, your hunger and fullness cues can't really be relied upon right now. So we can talk about that in theory, like those two principles right now, but we're not going to be super relying on them right now, because the more important principle for us to prioritize at this moment is really getting your body back into a place where it's stable.
Yeah, because when it's not stable, it can't even tune into those cues. Like those cues are not going to be reliable if you're not nourished enough, because your body actually will not give you enough hunger signals, probably give you early fullness signals. Like it gets all kinds of screwy when you're not eating enough. So yeah, it's, I think, so important to kind of hold off on those principles until you're actually renourished. And that can take a while, and that can take a meal plan from an experienced eating disorder dietitian, maybe not like, certainly I hope not a detailed meal plan that's like X cups of this and weigh and measure that, because that's also super unhelpful and diety. But, a plan that gets you eating consistently throughout the day, enough food to support recovery at the physiological level.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was your first introduction to intuitive eating. It sounds like you interpreted it through a very disordered lens. How did things shift for you after that?
At some point, I just later down the line wound up working with a different dietitian in my outpatient work with this dietitian. And she introduced me to intuitive eating and health at every size. And I think I was really ready for it at that point, like really ready for that conversation and really ready for real recovery at that point, because this was after several years of just cycling through different levels of care. But I was pretty ready for it. But when she started talking about that, I kind of approached that situation with a lot of resistance and just wanting to prove her wrong because I was pretty far along in my degree in nutrition at that point. And I was learning in a very weight centric environment. And I was like, this can't be a thing. Like, there's no way that this is real. And so we would sit there and like use our session time to just kind of debate this a little bit. And I would go home and like look up all of this stuff and with fully with the intent to go back to her and be like, you're wrong. This doesn't make any sense. But like in that process, I somehow started to like actually understand it and get on board with it. And my entire brain just like exploded pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, of course, like, especially as a dietitian, to be in like someone far along in your nutrition studies, I can't imagine how that must have felt, just completely breaking down your worldview.
Yeah. I mean, it was very confusing for me as a nutrition student to be like, I'm like learning these two separate things at the same time that do not mix well. So, I mean, I definitely became very vocal in my nutrition classes and in my professor's office hours and just really putting my opinion out there and kind of starting to, by the end, I was just straight up like raising my hand in class and questioning some of the things they were saying. But it definitely, like my entire life just flipped 180. It was pretty wild.
Yeah, it really does completely turn the tables when you first discover that. And it sounds like you didn't really have much of an experience of intuitive eating as a child that you can remember. It sounds like you saw a lot of diets around you all the time anyway. So I bet it was a little mind-blowing to think, oh, I could have been eating this way all along.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that was really off-putting to me about it at the beginning, because I think that's a lot of the language that's used around intuitive eating. Like, oh, all kids are intuitive eaters. We're all born intuitive eaters. And I was like, I don't have any memories of that. So I'm not really sure that that exists. But one of the almost like defining few months of the past few years for me was, I think it was right after my senior year, it was right before my dietetic internship. I like had that summer kind of free. because I like didn't have to really do anything else to resume build because I was about to start my internship. And I grew up going to sleepaway camp. And I was like, I just want to go back to camp and work at camp as a counselor because I think that would be so fun because I grew up going to this camp and just loved it there. And so I went to this camp and I was a counselor for 12-year-olds. And it was just the most fun experience ever in general, but it was super interesting to me coming from this place where that was really at the time where I was like, I get intuitive eating, I get health at every size. Like had already been speaking up a lot in my classes about all of this and really on board with it, but I just didn't have any memories of being an intuitive eater. And then here I am with 12-year-olds who are right in the middle of like diet culture hitting them head on. And I would say like the best way to describe this bunk full of girls was they were very age appropriate. Like half of them were still kids, still 12-year-olds. And then the other half of them were like putting on makeup and like doing all that kind of stuff. Like we would play music in the morning and the playlist would switch from like Frozen to like a rap song and back and forth like that. So that was kind of the best way to describe these kids. And so really they were all right in the middle of this transition where they're still kind of intuitive eaters. A lot of them still really were. And then you could really see the ones where diet culture had kind of hit them full on. So it was just a really interesting thing for me to experience, to be like, okay, yeah, I see this. I know that this is a thing. Like kids really are intuitive eaters. And there really are these like diet culture messages that are so harmful that can really affect somebody's ability to eat intuitively. And so even though I still don't really have very many memories of that, like I just can look back on my experience with these kids. And I think that was pretty healing for me in a lot of ways, just to be able to experience that.
Yeah, it sounds like it, because you can sort of live vicariously through them, almost, the ones that are still intuitive eaters, and also see that transition where it's like, it's obvious that it's the culture, it's not them. They're getting indoctrinated into this cultural thing that, I mean, so many kids get indoctrinated into much younger, like you did, or some people like Isabel Fox and Duke, who's been on the podcast a number of times, said it was like when she was 2 or 3, she was put on her first diet. So it's like, certainly can hit people at a very young age. But I think for a lot of kids, it does happen around adolescence, where that sort of blissful childhood phase of intuitive eating kind of comes to an end and they're just smacked in the face with diet culture.
Yeah. And then one of the other things that happened that summer was I had a girl in my bunk who had type 1 diabetes. And so that's also really where my interest in diabetes stemmed from, because it was just so fascinating to see, because I could separate these girls in my mind of like, here's the ones that like are still really intuitive eaters, and here's the ones that kind of aren't or are being influenced by diet culture in some way. And she definitely fell on that side of it. And it was so blatantly obvious to me that it was because of her diabetes. And that just really stood out to me. And I remember like trying to do some research like on some of my time off, and like when I actually had cell service, and like trying to look things up and be like, is there anything out there about like intuitive eating with type 1 diabetes? Because I wanted to know more about it, and also like wanted to be able to help this kid because she was just struggling. And it was just so interesting to me that this was happening, and it was because of her diabetes, and that there was no resources about it anywhere that I could find.
That's wild. Why do you think that is?
That there's no resources?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's just kind of the diabetes world in general is so steeped in diet culture in so many different ways. And a lot of the people that provide like diabetes education and diabetes care are educated as well in like a really weight normative environment. And so the reality is, right, that like a lot of us that talk about intuitive eating and health at every size are really more in the disordered eating disorder world, because like that makes sense. But I think because of that, there's like not like we live in this little bubble off to the side where like there's not enough of us doing this work and like providing education and another alternative in more of like the medical field. And so the diabetes world is just so problematic in so many ways.
Yeah, because diabetes is so medicalized. It's considered sort of a mainstream medical condition. Like it's a condition that doctors deal with, and you have to like work with a doctor or a dietitian who specializes in diabetes, who, yeah, like you said, the people who come up in that world can just stay in this very weight-centric paradigm and probably never, a lot of them, I think, never get exposed to health at every size or intuitive eating because that's just not what they're seeing. They're seeing people who have diabetes and are probably really bought in to diet culture themselves because they're scared and they've been told to be scared and they've been told to lose weight and diet and that weight loss is the key and all this stuff. So I think it's probably less likely that people who come up in that world will be exposed to intuitive eating. So I loved hearing your talk at the Weight Inclusive Nutrition and Dietetics Conference in DC a few months ago. And you talked about like building a bridge between the HAES and intuitive eating world and the diabetes world and how important that bridge is, because the diabetes world is kind of sitting out there on its own island, and like HAES and intuitive eating are kind of our own island, but we really need to bring HAES and intuitive eating into all of medicine.
Yeah, I mean, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you come from this diabetes world or this like diabetes island that I had in that example of thinking about diabetes management for all types of diabetes as like carb counting and monitoring all these numbers of like your blood sugar and your A1C and all of that kind of stuff, talking about exercise is like 1,000% necessary all the time, talking about weight loss, it doesn't resonate and it doesn't make sense when people start talking to you about intuitive eating or health at every size, saying, yeah, like eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full and like eating what you want and not talking about numbers, not talking about your weight. It's not about weight. Like it just doesn't really resonate and it doesn't make sense. And I think a lot of people in the health at every size world just tend to shy away from those difficult conversations around how we can make these things coexist. And maybe it's not necessarily shying away from those conversations. I think a lot of times people just don't really know how to bridge that gap, but it's definitely a very difficult conversation to be had because the people in the diabetes world, that doesn't make any sense to them. It appears to go completely against what they say.
What would you say to someone who's coming from that world, like someone listening to the podcast who has diabetes and who's been told they need to lose weight, who's been told they need to carb count or restrict their carbs or even cut out carbs entirely, or they can never have sugar? What would you say to someone like that who is curious about intuitive eating and HAES, and maybe they're listening to this podcast because they struggle with those recommendations, they are not at peace with food and want to be? What would you say to them?
I mean, I would be really curious about how that's played out for them and how those recommendations have affected their life in positive and or negative ways, and just really get curious about that experience for them. Oftentimes I find that for the clients that I work with, that those recommendations, they like intellectually make sense, but physically they lead to a lot of restriction or feelings of deprivation. And that eventually plays into this restrict-binge cycle, which is even more complicated with diabetes because then you have like the physical aspect of like blood sugar changes as well within that cycle. And it just gets really messy really quickly.
And that's dangerous too for people with diabetes, right? That restrict-binge cycle is actually more problematic for people's health.
Yeah. I mean, in the immediate, it can be very, very damaging, right? Because if you're like not eating enough and then your blood sugar is going low and then you're binging on something, and particularly it's probably going to be something pretty high carb because you're restricting carbs, then your blood sugar is going to spike pretty high. You're going to feel really crappy about it. And so that's not great overall, physically, mentally, any of that. But I think even more importantly, in the long term, that cycle, it plays out into weight cycling, right? Where we're losing and gaining weight repeatedly over a period of time. And we know that weight cycling increases insulin resistance. And that is kind of the last thing that you really want to be contributing to when you're already working with diabetes. So it gets really, really harmful really quickly.
Yeah, and insulin resistance, can you talk a little bit about that for anyone who doesn't know? Because I feel like that term gets thrown around a lot. A lot of diets now are like, reduces insulin resistance, and that's just total BS. But what is insulin resistance and how does it play into diabetes management?
The best way to explain it, that kind of anybody that works in the diabetes world, or if you have diabetes, you've definitely heard this, but we talk about like the lock and the key, right? Where your cell, it needs the glucose to get inside, because that's how it gets its energy. And the glucose is kind of sitting outside the cell. And in order for it to get in the door, we need to unlock the door. And the insulin is kind of that key that unlocks the door. So without the insulin, you don't really have a way to open the door to let the glucose come inside. And so with insulin resistance, we talk about it as being kind of like a broken key, like it's just not working correctly. And so really what we're talking about biologically is that the insulin is having a really hard time connecting with those receptors on the cells. And so it makes it hard for the glucose or the sugar to get inside of your cells. And so then you wind up with elevated blood sugar levels. So with type 2 diabetes, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about this insulin resistance where the body's still making insulin fine at the beginning. And it's just the insulin's having a hard time communicating with the cell to get the glucose inside. And over time, what starts to happen, right? Because immediately your body's going to be like, cool, well, I guess I just need some more insulin because like I need it in order to function. So your body keeps sending more signals to make more insulin and more insulin. And that helps because then you get enough keys that actually work to let all of the glucose inside so your blood sugar levels normalize. Over time, that can lead to your pancreas, which makes your insulin getting a little bit burnt out on that. Because if your pancreas is like a mom, a little kid that's like, mom, 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 all the time, that's like really annoying. And so that's kind of the way I like to think about it. But that's kind of what's happening. And so the pancreas starts to get a little bit burnt out. And that's when we start winding up with like some more problems that can really be classified as diabetes, where it's not just the insulin resistance, there's not enough insulin there as well to kind of make up for that deficiency.
And so that's when people would end up having to take medication, either oral medication or insulin to make up for that.
Yeah. So there are different types of medications that somebody can take. They could take some type of oral medication. So like the most common is metformin, and that helps to increase insulin sensitivity. So to counteract that insulin resistance. So it kind of works in that way. Or we could have somebody that starts taking insulin to kind of like supplement the insulin that their body is not able to produce. That's type 2. I think one of my biggest frustrations in that world right now is all of these diets that are out there that are talking about like, you can cure your diabetes with this, because it's just so scary and so harmful. But the analogy that I like to use is ultimately at the end of the day, like your body is insulin resistant. Like that's something that's going on. And sure, like if you don't eat carbs, if you like do whatever diets are being suggested where you're like, cool, like just don't eat carbs, then yeah, like you're going to have less sugar in your blood because you're not eating as much. And so sure, maybe like your blood sugar is going to be lower. That doesn't mean that you've cured your body of diabetes. It just means that your blood sugar isn't high. So there really isn't a solid definition of like what it means to cure diabetes. It's like really annoying and really frustrating. And I feel like I have this conversation at least once a week. But the analogy that I like to use is it's kind of the same as if somebody needs reading glasses because they have some pretty bad eyesight, but then they just choose to not read anything for the rest of their life. So like, cool, like you don't need glasses to read anymore, but that doesn't mean that you've cured your eyes. It just means that you're not going to read anything for the rest of your life.
And like, how sad would that be to not read anything for the rest of your life?
Right. It's like, yeah, you could totally get through the rest of your life without reading anything. It might be a pretty sad existence, but like you could do it. And kind of the same thing with these like lower carb diets. It's like, yeah, I guess you could. That would likely, talking to these clients that I work with, it's like that usually plays out in some kind of restrict-binge pattern. But theoretically, you could not eat carbs, but that doesn't seem like a very great existence, even if you could manage to do it without it playing into some disordered eating. So,
and yeah, there's that small percentage of people, maybe on the order of the, 2 to 5% or whatever of quote unquote successful dieters. Maybe that's around the same percentage that could just choose to not eat carbs forever to try to manage their diabetes. And so that just puts them in the camp of like, Bummerville, like sad life, hard life, a lot of asceticism and self-denial and work to try to maintain that. And then for the rest of the people, that 95 to 98% likely is going to be restrict binge cycling. It's going to be difficulty actually maintaining that diet because our bodies need carbs, even people with diabetes, right? From what I've seen, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but like from what I've seen, it really is true that people's bodies generally function best with carbohydrates, even people with diabetes, in terms of energy, in terms of not binging, in terms of having a peaceful relationship with food. We all need some carbohydrate to be able to achieve that because our bodies are really programmed to freak out, for lack of a better term, in the absence of adequate carbohydrate. We're in starvation mode when we don't have enough carbohydrate.
Totally. And I mean, I hear this from my clients all the time where they're like, yeah, but I have diabetes. So like, doesn't that change? And it's like, no, your body's still human. Like your body's still going to freak out when you don't have carbs. And I mean, I think the biggest conversation that I have too is this idea of like how this plays into the restrict binge cycle. And you're not immune from this restrict binge cycle just because you have diabetes. Like it still happens the same way and your body still needs carbs. And that is important for people to know.
So important and so not talked about. I feel like there's this myth out there in diet culture that people with diabetes, they're allergic to carbs or something, or that carbs are not necessary for them because their bodies can't handle them. And when in reality, it's very different. You know, it is. I love your analogy. Like, I feel like it's much more like needing reading glasses than it is an allergy to something.
Yeah, it's not an allergy. It's not. That just, I get so mad when people talk about it in that way. And then I think, I mean, as well, we didn't really touch on this, but so we talked about type 2, but type 1 diabetes functions a little bit differently in the body, where it's not stemming from that insulin resistance. Instead, there's something that's happening in the body. It's an immune reaction where the body's immune system kind of attacks part of their pancreas that makes their insulin. And so they don't make any insulin. And the reason why I bring that up is just because that's something that comes up with my clients that have type 1 all the time. And even my friends that have type 1, it's a huge frustration to them because they feel like in society, we don't talk about, I mean, we don't, it's true. We don't talk about type 1 diabetes as much as we talk about type 2. And they get so frustrated and angry when people start talking about diabetes, or they say that they have diabetes and it's like, oh, well, you can't eat that, right? Like you can't eat all these things. And they're like, no, actually, like I can, I just have to take my insulin for it. But there's just a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on as well, because there's just not enough education on the different types of diabetes and what is actually real. There's just so many myths and misconceptions out there.
Completely. And I think, yeah, this idea of that you can actually eat carbs and have, an intuitive relationship with food and have diabetes, and you just have to take insulin or medication, I think is pretty contrary to what diet culture is saying about diabetes now, but also just about diseases in general, that it's like, just manage it through food. Don't take meds. Get off your meds. You can just change your diet and you'll get off all your meds. And that's really, really harmful, because we've spoken about this on the podcast a lot, that changing your eating is actually something that has side effects. It's an intervention with serious potential side effects. And we see these side effects so often in the people with disordered eating and the people listening to this podcast. Basically, you wouldn't be here if your attempts to change your eating and go on a diet and do something to maybe manage a health condition like diabetes, if that had worked for you seamlessly. You end up with disordered eating oftentimes because of those efforts to diet and manage conditions through food alone or through food primarily. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough in general with health conditions, is that like it's actually super dangerous to go messing around with your diet. And medications have side effects too, but for certain conditions, I would say, and for certain people, probably most people listening to this podcast, I would say that the side effects of dieting to try to manage a health condition are far greater than and worse for your overall well-being than the side effects of a medication that you might be able to take to manage that condition.
Totally. And there's especially in the diabetes world, there's so much shame around having to take medications. And I really think this stems from just the intense amount of healthism in our world in general, and especially within the medical community and the diabetes community, where it's just, there's all of this talk of, oh, well, how can I get off of this medication or take less of that? And this idea of being like a quote unquote good diabetic is really prevalent for so many people that I talk to. And I always say this, that like hyper focusing on food or your body size, that's not part of being a good diabetic. That's really just a part of an eating disorder. So there's just all of this shame and stigma and all of this around having to take medications, maybe not having like a quote unquote perfect A1C and just all of the numbers, all of the labs and all of the numbers and everything there. And it just gets really problematic really quickly.
And I think too, a lot of the people who recommend changing your eating in order to change a certain health condition or manage a certain health condition haven't personally experienced, or maybe have, but don't identify that they've personally experienced. They don't identify the suffering of it, personally experience that disordered eating, that negative side effect of the diet. And so they're prescribing something to people that in theory should work, but they don't understand the lived experience when the person tries it. When the diabetes educator says, okay, we need to get your A1C down to or whatever, which is actually ridiculous. I think I heard you say in your talk, like that's kind of a ridiculous number for someone with diabetes.
Yeah.
But they'll aim for that kind of thing. And then it just, the person who's actually having to do this, it will drive them up a wall because they're not capable of doing that. And their body needs some medication and some help to manage their blood sugar. And yet they're being forced to jump through all these hoops, or maybe sort of forcing themselves to jump through all these hoops to manage it through food, instead of acknowledging that medication could be helpful and that there's nothing shameful or wrong about medication.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also just comes from a huge place of privilege, whether that's privilege of not having experienced any kind of disordered eating or understanding how that can play out in disordered eating, or privilege of not having actually experienced diabetes, or whether that just comes from other types of privilege where food can be that accessible and that big of a deal in your life. There's just a lot of privilege in all of those philosophies and statements about how to manage diabetes.
What would you say to someone who is struggling with this idea that they're supposed to be managing their diabetes without medication, that they're supposed to be cutting carbs or skimping on carbs or not eating sugar? How do you work with folks in that boat?
I mean, really taking a look at what beliefs and fears they have around those things and where they think they come from, and starting to unpack that a little bit. And that can be really, really scary. Like, I just want to acknowledge that can be really scary, especially when diabetes complications are honestly terrifying and people are so scared of that. And that makes a lot of sense. But a lot of times what we talk about together is kind of exploring what it would look like for them to kind of break some of those rules that they have. Like, would it actually be as terrible and awful and absolutely not okay as they think it would be? And oftentimes what we find is that they actually have much better health outcomes and feel a lot better physically and mentally once we start to kind of break that apart. And I mean, I think a lot of that also comes from, for most people, it's a lot of fear of carbs and eating sugar and all that kind of stuff. And like we said before, our bodies need carbs and they feel a heck of a lot better when we're eating them. So there's a lot to unpack and a lot to start to question about what your thoughts and beliefs are around your diabetes management, and whether that's related to food or different types of medication or different types of technology that you're using to manage your diabetes, all of that kind of stuff. There's just a lot to really take a look at and kind of question what you're doing and why you're doing it.
You know, it struck me when you were talking about how people feel physically and mentally better when they start allowing themselves to break free from some of those restrictions. I think there's this sense in which, you know, when someone's feeling bad, right, or when they have a condition, like they first get diagnosed with a condition like diabetes and they're told, okay, you need to cut carbs and don't eat sugar in order to manage this. And then they do it and they feel worse. The tendency is not to blame the diet, but to blame themselves and to blame their disease and think, oh, my disease is making me feel bad, that it's progressing or it's getting worse. And I need to do this harder now. I need to restrict more. I need to, you know, I'm not cutting out enough carbs. I'm not doing this enough. I'm not doing that enough. Rather than looking at, were you already feeling bad when you got diagnosed and told these things? Or are there ways in which the diet itself, the prescription itself of whatever quote unquote lifestyle changes you're supposed to be doing to manage the disease has actually contributed to the feeling worse? And how might counterintuitively easing up on some of those restrictions actually help you feel better physically and mentally? I know that can be totally scary, like you said, and people often have like a visceral resistance to that. Like that can't possibly be. And if I'm already feeling this bad, why would I want to do something that I believe will make me feel worse? But I think a lot of people misattribute the feeling worse to the disease or to not managing it well enough instead of attributing it to maybe the supposed cure is what's actually worsening my feelings.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what you mentioned really makes a lot of sense, especially in the context of understanding that most of the time when people start engaging in these diets and restrictions around food, it's right after they're diagnosed. And right when you're diagnosed, you feel pretty crappy, regardless of what kind of diabetes it is. I mean, with type 2, usually you're diagnosed and your blood sugar is pretty high, and that's not a really comfortable feeling. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most is, as you were talking, is specifically thinking about in the type 1 world, where we have patients and clients that when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, your blood sugar is really freaking high. Oftentimes there's some pretty scary complications going on, and you feel really shitty. And what also happens is that one of the symptoms of undiagnosed type 1 diabetes is weight loss. And so it's really interesting to hear some of my clients' stories and how this has played out for them, because it's exactly what you were talking about. So at the beginning, like when they're first diagnosed, they like feel really crappy. And then they start with all of their diabetes education and treatment and whatever. And they start gaining weight back because that's what their body needed to do because their weight loss was not at all healthy for their body. Like their body was really just breaking itself apart. And then they have some weight gain and they're feeling like physically better in a lot of ways, but because there's weight gain, there's a lot of like mental distress that comes with that, and just like a lot of discomfort in their body that comes with that. And I mean, sometimes that's just truly because it happens really quickly and that can be scary, but also just the diet culture that we live in, that any kind of weight gain is bad and weight loss is always a positive thing, that it becomes this really complicated dynamic where it's like, okay, well, I'm feeling like kind of better, but also like I'm gaining weight. And so that's not okay. And then it just gets really confusing and really hard to tell like what's actually helping, because then you start convincing yourself that, well, this isn't helping, this isn't good because now I'm gaining weight. So it's exactly what you were talking about.
And yeah, also that like, oh, if I'm gaining weight, then it must mean that I should cut out more foods or exercise harder or eat less overall, or like all of these things that will then exacerbate how bad you feel, make you feel worse in the long run, usually, because they're just restricting you more and your body needs that energy. And part of the reason you were feeling so crappy before, especially with type 1, right, is like when the glucose is not getting into the cells to that degree, when it's those levels of high blood sugar, it means your body is starving for energy. It's starved for glucose. And that's why, like you said, your body's actually breaking itself apart in order to stay alive, in order to get enough glucose to sustain itself, because it's like breaking down your body, breaking down your internal organs and stuff in some cases.
Well, yeah, because the cells interpret it as, well, there's no glucose getting in, so there's no glucose in the body, clearly. I mean, that's not what's happening, but that's how the cells interpret it. And so they start sending out all these signals to all the rest of the parts of your body to like get glucose in there any way possible. And one of the really cool things that our body can do is convert protein, which is muscle, into carbs. And so our body's going to start breaking down all sorts of muscles, including our organs. That's really what's happening.
And that's what happens with eating disorders too, right? It's like so interesting to think about the parallels between starvation from disordered eating of any kind and any size body, right? This can happen. And we actually just had a very cool study came out about quote unquote atypical anorexia, which is really higher weight. It's actually typical,
Yep.
But it's the higher weight version of anorexia, having a lot of the same medical complications as the lower weight version of anorexia. And I see this in clients all the time, that people have signs and symptoms that their body is catabolizing protein, is breaking down their muscles and their internal organs to keep itself alive, even in larger bodies or even in quote unquote average size bodies. This happens to people across the weight spectrum, but it's interesting to think about the starvation response that happens in eating disorders, that can happen in food insecurity and genuine famines in parts of the world that still have, that are really affected by environmental famine.
Yeah. it's all the same thing, right? I mean, there's a different cause and a different start to it, but I mean, it's malnutrition. So that's really what's going on.
Yeah. And so like, I mean, all this restriction, right? Because I feel like there's this starvation response that's going on in the body, and then it's met with prescriptions of restriction. Oftentimes, especially with the weight gain that can happen either in early, recovery and healing from type 1, or also in the process of developing type 2. Weight gain seems to be a symptom, right? It's not a cause like people in diet culture make it out to be, but it seems to be a symptom or something that goes along with the development of type 2. And so people with diabetes are then met with these prescriptions to lose weight and restrict, which makes it all even worse. And so how can people manage diabetes without restriction? How can they stop falling prey to these restrictive diets and start easing up and eating more intuitively?
I mean, that's a big question. There's a lot that plays into that. Just because I see this in so many people, this restrict-binge cycle that plays out, it's just so familiar to so many people with diabetes. I approach it in pretty much the same way that we approach breaking that cycle with any other disordered eating or eating disorder client that we work with, right? You have to stop that cycle. And it doesn't start with the binge. It's not a lack of self-control. It stems from this restriction. And so being able to make peace with food, and as scary as that sounds, like it is really important in breaking that cycle and being able to start to normalize and regulate that eating pattern instead of going from those one extreme to the other all the time of like restricting and then eating everything. We have to kind of, almost with that pendulum analogy, like kind of settle it back down a little bit, right? And so that definitely is a hugely important factor to be working on. And then there's also this other layer of understanding that, like, yes, with diabetes, like, we are concerned about blood sugar. And I think that's where everybody's hesitation comes from, right? It's like, okay, but yeah, like I get that, but I don't want to eat too many carbs. I don't want my blood sugar to go high. I don't want all of these complications from that. And that's really scary to think about. And I mean, again, kind of what we mentioned before, like I talk about how when we're restricting and binging, like our blood sugar is bouncing all over the place. So like that's also not super helpful for having stable blood sugars in any kind of diabetes. And then as well, like this weight cycling, increasing insulin resistance, that's also not going to be super helpful in that way. And then there is a certain point where we can start talking about some kind of gentle nutrition, like how we phrase it in intuitive eating. But really, I mean, kind of like we were talking about before, I think that hyper focusing on that, even if you have diabetes, is not the most helpful thing to start with. I think that really still, like, I mean, with intuitive eating, we talk about this all the time, that like that piece kind of comes last. And I feel like it is pretty much the same with diabetes. Hyper focusing on that nutrition piece can really get in the way of trying to like stabilize and normalize the disordered eating patterns that somebody has gotten into.
It's interesting too when you say that, because I think a lot of people in general in diet culture want to fast track to the gentle nutrition principle of intuitive eating. But I think especially with diabetes, there's this tendency to like fast track it to there because it's like, oh, well, I have to use nutrition to manage my diabetes. It's like not optional, or it can't come later. And I think the thing that you're saying about kind of like dealing with the disordered eating first, addressing the restrict binge cycling and the weight cycling that are happening, that are worsening someone's condition, is actually really important to tackle first. Because also when you think about like the mental piece of this, you can't have long-term sustainable healing from disordered eating with or without diabetes or any other health condition if you don't get through that mental stuff first, if you don't address the mindset and challenge the beliefs and heal from the internalized diet culture and weight stigma that are driving you to weight cycle and, have all kinds of other disordered behaviors. And so addressing that first is possible. I mean, it's great to hear you say that it is possible even with diabetes. I think that can give people a lot of relief and a lot of maybe permission to do that.
Yeah. And we talk about diabetes burnout a lot in the diabetes world. And honestly, I feel like most of that is just some variation of disordered behavior around diabetes that just then is so distressing, and it really does lead to burnout. And so I think that there's a really strong connection between those things, kind of like you were saying. We have to focus on stabilizing the eating and just the way, all of the mental health around it and everything before we can really focus on that nutrition piece. And so really giving my clients permission to do that is one of the most fun parts about my job. And I love doing that, even though it is really scary for a lot of people. I would add that just addressing, like, because I know this question comes up all the time with type 1, and when you're taking with type 1, or if you're taking insulin with type 2, you do have to kind of know the carbs in your food to be able to dose your insulin. And so that is like a tricky thing that comes up when we're trying to talk about this, where it's like, well, don't worry about the nutrition, like gentle nutrition later, but also like you kind of do need to know the carbs. And I like to approach that by kind of talking about how, it's never going to be exact anyway. And I think we like to, in the diabetes world, like to think about our insulin and carb ratios as like being these perfect numbers that are always exact. And it's like, no, there's a bajillion things, like literally endless things that can affect your blood sugar. Like one of my clients last night was like, the weather has been like kind of different. Like it's a little bit drier out and I've been running high. Like I think it's because of that. Like there's just so many things that can affect your blood sugar. And so it's never going to be these like exact numbers. And so I think leading into that flexibility around it. And with some clients, we do like exact carb count if that's what's going to be helpful for them. So they'll like look up the exact carbs and whatever and dose their insulin based on that. But after like a couple of days of that and us talking about it, they usually start to realize that it doesn't really make that much of a difference if you're doing it exactly and measuring it out and counting everything exactly versus just being able to kind of like guesstimate a little bit. And so we kind of approach it from that perspective of let's be a little bit more flexible with it because we don't have to be so rigid and we can still manage our diabetes. And I think when you take the focus off of those numbers and those exact carb counts, it starts to help you tune into your body and what's actually going on around you and all the other things that affect your blood sugar and how your particular body responds to this particular food. Because Christy, you and I could both eat a banana and our blood sugar is going to do different things. So that's just the reality. And so I like to take the focus away from those exact numbers and that like quote unquote nutrition piece of it and be a little bit more flexible with it because it does ultimately help my clients tune into their bodies a lot more and have a much better handle on what's going on with their diabetes.
Yeah. And that's such a great point too, that knowing how something is affecting their blood sugar on a particular day can be helpful in maybe deciding how much to dose yourself in the future with insulin for this particular thing, but also might be very temporally specific too. There might be a day when like your blood sugar is running high for some completely different reason, like having less water in your body, being more dehydrated or something like that.
Being stressed, having your period, like literally there's 1,000 different things.
Yeah. And so having that flexibility and ability to just be intuitive about it rather than making it all about the food too. Because I think, in diet culture in general and with diabetes specifically, I see a lot of people wanting to like make everything about the food and the exercise and that's it, rather than taking into account all these other factors in people's lives that affect not just blood sugar, but everything, their overall well-being. And so people go looking, go on these wild goose chases of like, what foods am I sensitive to? Because I feel a little bloated after I eat this, or I feel tired when I have this, and like blah, blah, blah. And in so many cases, it's not the food at all. It's other circumstances of their lives that are happening around that, including anxiety about the food. And so looking at things in a truly holistic sense, things other than just food and movement, is so helpful for health conditions in general, but also diabetes in particular. It sounds like your work really takes into account a lot of these other factors too.
Yeah, I don't think that you can manage diabetes if you're not taking into account all of these other factors. They're so important.
It's not just about the food and movement.
No, it isn't for anything really, but no. Especially with the diabetes.
Yes. Well, that is so great. I love hearing you say that. And I feel like this episode is going to give a lot of people permission to start managing their diabetes in a way that's a lot less rigid and more intuitive and flexible. So really glad to have this conversation. Thank you so much for everything you shared. And can you tell us where people can find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, I am mostly on Instagram. I think I have a Twitter, but I don't know how to work it. My Instagram is Go Feed Yourself. And you can find me on my website as well, laurennewmanrd.com.
We'll put links to those in the show notes too, so people can click through. And thank you so much for being here. It's such a delight to talk to you.
Thank you, Christy.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Lauren Newman for joining us on this episode and sharing all her wisdom. And thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you want to help support the podcast, please share this episode and make sure that you're subscribed to the pod as well by going to christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/224. That's christyharrison.com/224. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by thredUP. Shopping sustainably in the new year just got a whole lot easier and more affordable with thredUP. Get an exclusive offer of an extra 30% off your first order when you go to thredup.com/foodpsych. That's thredup.com/foodpsych for 30% off your first order today. Terms apply. This episode was also brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it online, or pop into your local independent bookstore and ask for Anti-Diet. A big thanks to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.